Well, this is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters, and I am the host, John Moorhead. I'm privileged today to have as my co-host, Charles Randall Paul, who has also been here in the past as a guest. He is the president and founder of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. We have two special guests today who will be helping us understand aspects of the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And we are privileged to have very busy schedules, so we want to get right to it, but I want to introduce them and read a little bit of their bios. And I'm hoping I got a little bit of coaching ahead of time for name pronunciation here. So I'm hoping I get it correct. First of all, we have Paul Gavrilyuk. I hope I was close with that. He holds the Aquinas Chair in Theology and Philosophy at the Theology Department of the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was born in Kyiv, Ukraine. He studied physics at Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology in Russia. And he is very busy these days raising funds. And we want to mention both at the beginning and at the end, you could find information in the podcast notes for his nonprofit Rebuild Ukraine. And we're encouraging everybody to support that. He's also founding president of the International Orthodox Theological Association. And again, look in the program notes for more bio and links. We are also privileged to have Cyril Hovorun. He is Professor of Ecclesiology, International Relations and Ecumenism at Saint Ignatios and Professor at Stockholm School of Theology. And he's taught theology at a number of confessional and public institutions, including theological academies in Kiev, Moscow, Minsk, and elsewhere. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, again, normally I take the lead in being the host, but I'm going to admit my ignorance. I do have a colleague, Father Brendan Pelfrey, who's Eastern Orthodox, and we've had some conversations over the years, but I have much to learn about the Orthodox tradition, and I will turn over the remainder of the lead of our questions and conversation to my colleague, Charles Randall Paul.
Thanks, John. I'm grateful that we have this little conversation today. It's incredibly important for, I think, all of us to understand, at least in our audience. We have a large evangelical and broader audience than that, how Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, has developed in its relationship to Russian Orthodoxy, and how that relationship might be ultimately a source for both conflict and collaboration in ending the current conflict in the Ukraine. That is kind of the context for this conversation. And I'll start right out by saying most people are probably familiar with the great schism that occurred between Roman and Eastern Orthodoxy. And I won't go there. I'd like you to let us know within Eastern Orthodoxy, as it has developed, how does the question of authority guide your church? How did you develop, in other words, not a single pope, but various different leaderships? Could you give us a little both ecclesiastical history, and then I'll ask some theological questions.
Whom do you want to talk?
Either one of you, just go ahead.
Okay, good.
Cyril, go ahead.
Maybe I'll try to explain briefly. Indeed, the structure of the Eastern Christianity is different from the structure of the Western churches, primarily the Catholic Church. Even though, yes, some institutions of the Western Christianity originate from the East, like the Institute of Popes. Probably not many people know that originally the popes emerged in the East, in Alexandria, and later on the Bishop of Rome adopted this title. During the first millennium, we constituted one single community. We were in complete communion with one another, the Christian East and the Christian West. Then our ways parted somehow. And the basic difference between the two families of the churches, like if you take the Catholic Church and the Eastern Christian churches, is that the Eastern Christian churches look more like a commonwealth of independent or autocephalous churches. I think I would compare it with the Anglican Communion, the Commonwealth of the Anglican churches, which are essentially the provinces of the Anglican Church are independent autocephalous, and they have a primate who somehow coordinates the activities, like the Archbishop of Canterbury. In our case, it's more like the ecumenical patriarch or the patriarch, the Bishop of Constantinople, who resides in what is now Istanbul. So instead of one pyramid, so to say, of the ecclesial structures in the Catholic Church, we have several pyramids, like, you know, in the Valley of Kings in Egypt, that stand next to each other, and they each has its own kind of self-sufficiency. They're independent autocephalous, and they are in full communion with one another. And the relationship between them is described most best by what we call consent. So it's a consensual relationship between the churches. There is no kind of obligation that the churches need to, you know, to hear, to follow the line set by the ecumenical patriarchy. They choose to follow or choose not to follow this line. So it's a consensual relationship between the churches, and it's
Father Cyril,
really like, yeah. So it's a consensual relationship, and it's more like a commonwealth of the churches.
No, I agree with everything that Father Cyril said. I think the crucial matter for our time is the fact that because you have several self-governing churches, these churches very often within the nation states are dependent on the governments in which they function. So Serbians, for example, on Serbia, Romanians on Romania, and certainly that's the case today for the Patriarch of Moscow, who is thoroughly dependent on the ruler of the Russian state, Vladimir Putin.
How many pyramids are there? Just for the ignorant populace, can you tell us
15.
15. 15. And in terms of size, which ones are the largest?
Well, the Russian Church is believed to be the largest one, indeed. But actually, for us, the size doesn't matter. Even though, you know, even though the Russian Church promotes itself as the largest church, but there is this idea that every church matters, regardless of its size. It's like in the international law, modern international law, that it doesn't matter what size is the state. All states have equal rights. So we have approximately the same perception about the churches.
Yes, and of course, Ukraine has a very substantial number of Orthodox believers, and if its churches were to unify, the Ukrainian church would have the second largest size, closely followed by Romania and then Greece.
That's a good answer. Thank you. Let's talk now about theology. Within the Protestant world, of course, there's schisms on top of schisms. There are literally thousands of Protestant denominations. That's a great word that was developed basically in the USA to try to say, well, are they churches or what are they? Well, they're denominations, right? That is a concept that's been developed here. And there are very different theological views in all of those denominations. What would you say the theological differences are between the pyramids, if any?
No, I would say that there is no difference basically between the pyramids, and we believe that we share the same faith. And moreover, we believe that we belong to the same church, one church, and we believe that this church is actually the church established by Jesus Christ. What we differ in are essentially the administrative structures. So those pyramids are not more than just administrative structures that help managing, you know, the kind of groups of people who believe to belong to the same church, share the same faith, participate in the same mysteries. Of course, we have our disagreements. We have kind of different expressions of our faith in terms of language, in terms of theological language, if you want, traditions. But yeah, I would say no. There is a consistent coherency between the theological traditions shared by those pyramids, and there are some some differences that can be quite crucial, like in the case of the Ukrainian war. The difference is not of theological nature, it's more of ideological nature, and that's something that needs to be addressed by the theologians. We believe that what has led to the war is a distortion of the tradition, a kind of aberration of the tradition under the influence of the ideological concepts, and one of them is the notorious Russian world concept. Probably we'll talk more about it, but that is basically the difference. We have some churches adopt kind of ideological frames which sometimes alienate them from the rest of the churches, as it is the case with the Russian church, I believe.
Paul, do you want to say anything more about that?
No, I think Cyril said it all. I think the faith is the same, but then there are some very, very, the things that matter and the things that divide us precisely have to do with the ideology, and it's the ideology of the so-called Russian world, Ruski Mir. And it's an ideology that sees itself as in opposition to the West, which it treats monolithically, and in which it, for example, very often ignores the evangelicals and ignores the extent to which America, broadly speaking, is certainly still a religious country.
Yes,
if I may add to this, another
Sure,
kind of point of differentiation that we experience in the Orthodox world, which is very well known in the evangelical world, is those notorious culture wars that ravage the U.S. terrain, the society, and the churches in the United States. I think we recently adopted the same kind of dichotomization, polarization within the Orthodox world, so that there are like conservatives and liberals within the Orthodox Church that don't really stomach each other very much. And if you take the war in Ukraine nowadays, it is to a great extent underpinned by a sort of culture war, when the Russian Church promotes, the traditional values and, the conservative kind of preferences for itself, and counterposes itself, the Russian Church, to some other church. Like they believe that the ecumenical patriarchate is liberal, is on the liberal side of the culture wars, and this is a sort of dangerous imported division, I would say, that contributes to this differentiation within the otherwise monolithic and singular orthodoxy.
That's very important for our audience to understand. So we'll dwell on that a little bit longer. I would say most Americans think it's, Russia versus the Ukraine, two nation states that are completely opposed for some political reasons. And Americans don't like to think about religion really being deeply involved in the conflict. So I think we need to emphasize what you both just brought up by going back in a little bit in history, and the idea of Kiev originally being kind of the third Rome, that there being something special about that form of orthodoxy that would lead out and almost in a messianic way bring peace and truth to the entire world, where the Western Church had failed to do that, and certainly where Enlightenment culture was failing to do that. So that is, as I read history, this is a very, very old idea that has been brought forward now, as you say, as part of the culture wars, and revivified by the Russians right now to use it contra Ukraine, which has sold out, its religious peoples have sold out to Western values, right? And therefore, there's a heretical aspect to this, that they're not fighting other Christians, they're fighting heretical Christians, right? And that is a deeply historical reality in the United States. I might have mentioned to both of you in my email, before the Civil War, 10 years before the Civil War, when we saw that it was coming, there was a schism effectively between all the Protestant groups. You had Southern Baptists separating from Northern Baptists, because at some deep level, they knew they were going to be fighting each other. And you don't fight a brother, but you can fight a heretic, right? And so I think, am I right to be analyzing things a little bit like that right now, or not?
Yes, but these categories actually don't apply, because what I want to emphasize is there is actually a shared faith. The important thing is the extent to which everything that Russian state is presently doing in the Russian church is actually spin and hypocrisy. And let me give you specific examples. Ukraine is a much more religious country, especially when you drift to the Polish West. You will find that religious adherence is 10% or higher and significantly higher in the villages. And this is primarily, of course, Greek Catholics, but also Orthodox and a substantial Protestant presence. Whereas the more you drift to the center of the country and the more you drift to the east, religious adherence actually goes down. And of course, in the so-called republics of Donetsk, etc., it's about 2% of the population, as it is in the rest of Russia. So any kind of notion, we can dream up these dreams of the third Rome, which of course was applied to Moscow, not quite to Kiev, and we can dream up these dreams of the second Jerusalem, but it's a question of how does one activate a particular ideological stance in this situation. And so it's one thing to think of some sort of unity between various Orthodox. It's quite different to simply to institute a genocide, which is actually going on right now, and the war against the weak and the war against civilian and children. So I think there's some fundamental differences of that order. Another significant element here is that Putin himself privately is not a religious man. It's not clear, in fact, if he believes in any God at all. Now, and that's unfortunate, and a lot of our Western interlocutors are sort of duped by seeing pictures of him in the church, etc. He is not a version of Ivan the Terrible. He is not a version of Stalin in the sense that Stalin was really an Orthodox deconvert. In other words, he, at some point he lapsed from the faith. Putin has never had the faith, but he uses the faith as a convenient ideology. And perhaps Father Cyril could also comment on what that ideology is and just weigh in on the whole issue. But the important thing here is fundamentally, as far as the fundamentals of faith are concerned, they are basically shared by Russians and Ukrainians. And that is what makes this particular war really Cain's attack against Abel. And that is what makes it fratricidal. And it's an aggression of one nation against the other. There's no second side here. And frankly, the world recognizes this, with the exception of a very small minority.
Okay, going to Cyril, you've been called to testify about the ideology. Help us understand this ideology.
Well, yes, thank you. Well, exactly. I believe that what we are dealing with in Ukraine is a sort of conflict between two attitudes to Christianity. One is the Christianity as an identity, and another is Christianity as faith. And what we are dealing in the case of Russia is to a great extent Christianity as an identity, what they call, the sociologists of religion call the cultural Christianity. When people, identify themselves with the church without really believing in God, if you ask, an average Russian, like 70–80% according to different polls, they would say we are Orthodox Christians. And if you ask them, do they believe in God? Most of them would say no, or they don't have, an idea what God is. So it's a cultural Christianity, and for them, exactly, this ideology of the Russian world has been constructed. It was constructed, I believe, by the church in order to attract those people who emerged from the Soviet atheism and to bring them back to the church. And the kind of design, well, kind of the mechanism constructed for this purpose. I think it was the purpose of evangelization of the Russian people behind this ideology of the Russian world. The purpose was exactly to construct a thing which is similar to the communist ideology, but that would attract people from atheism back to the church. It succeeded to some extent because it created this kind of identity or cultural Christianity when people kind of identify themselves without behaving or belonging to the church, really. And what they have is essentially a quasi-religious ideology, which looks like a religion, but it's not. And essentially, it's a modification of the Soviet ideology, or if you want, of imperial ideology, because it's a mixture, a very postmodern mixture of of the elements from the Tsarist Russia before the revolution, then the communist regime, Stalinism, and post-Soviet situation, like the kind of very primitive occultic, dualistic Manichaean approaches that Putin particularly embodies, I believe. And this is a very strange mixture of different religious elements that usually kind of don't fit each other in the organic setting, but in this ideology, they come together, they constitute this strange, complex kind of mixture of ideological elements, and they believe that this is orthodoxy. And in the name of this orthodoxy, they come and fight people who are in Ukraine and who are, well, most of them would be, naturally Orthodox. They didn't emerge from the Soviet situation. Many Ukrainians were occupied, the territories were occupied by Stalin after the harshest religious purges in the early 1920s, early 1930s. And we are talking about kind of a rural, very normal kind of Christianity of the most Ukrainian people who now face, this aggression from Russia. So essentially, as I said, we are dealing with a clash of the cultural Christianity, the Christianity as an identity, or Christianity as an ideology, against just kind of normal Christianity, I would say.
And so in evangelical terms, the insistence, the centrality of faith is completely lost in this equation. In other words, a religion is perceived precisely simply as a part of one's cultural identity. And that is why, and that is one of the main reasons why it could be weaponized, because there is actually no personal connection with Christ, with Jesus Christ. There is no centrality of what Christ, and that is why you turn to idols, including specifically the idol of war. Another comparison that I would use is that Russian Orthodoxy is experiencing its 9/11 moment. And what I mean by this specifically is that in the very same manner in which we thought about 9/11 as a profound distortion of Islam, in other words, Islam was weaponized specifically as an instrument of terrorism. In this particular situation, Russian Orthodoxy is being weaponized. And unfortunately, that includes the higher ups. That's to say, it includes Putin himself, and it includes Patriarch Kirill, who are doing the weaponization. It's weaponized in the service of essentially aggression and war. And I think perhaps the only distinction with Islam is that none of the major leaders of Islam would have ever expressed themselves publicly as supporting something like a 9/11 attack on the United States. Whereas in our situation, you do have the primate, the head of the Church of Moscow, effectively endorsing it, which is why if this war is lost, and it's likely to be lost by Russia, both Putin and Kirill will be morally and politically dead.
Help me. I work on. You gentlemen are extremely eloquent, by the way. Thank you for those direct answers. I would like to have you now do an exercise that we do at the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy in order to help people understand. What would you say? Speak in the voice of Patriarch Kirill. How would he be speaking as a Christian to Russian people? What you've talked about it as ideology, but I want you to speak as if you're a Russian Orthodox patriarch. What is he's obviously speaking religious language and religious symbols in order to accomplish this. So what is he saying to the Russian people?
So he's very concretely, he's not been keeping silent from the beginning of the war. Unlike some of his underlings, he has not kept silent. And so the Orthodox enter the period of Lent, which is this, if you will, you could compare it to a kind of a renewal, if you will, in the evangelical tradition, or recommitment to Christ in the evangelical tradition. So he's entered this period of Lent with the so-called Forgiveness Sunday, in which he said, Ukrainians have a lot to ask forgiveness for before Russia. And he, in fact, forgives them. So that was one statement that he was making as the Russian bombs were being dropped on peaceful Ukrainian cities, as people were dying in the hundreds, as actually children were being slaughtered. This is what a Russian patriarch said.
Excuse me, Paul. Yes. What did he say they needed to be forgiven of?
Well, it was, of course, perceived grievances against the Russian speakers. Father Cyril and I are both Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Father Cyril, of course, is thoroughly bilingual. I am primarily a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. And just as Hitler cited the grievances of the Germans against the Czechs when he invaded Czechoslovakia, Putin cited completely non-existent grievances of the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine against the Ukrainian-speaking population. Now, which population is he bombing now primarily? He's bombing, you've all heard.
Paul, since you're going to be leaving early, I'm going to press you on this. What did Patriarch Cyril, talking as out of a voice, what were his Christian words that defended or accused or needed forgiveness? I know President Putin's words, and I know his motives. I'm very curious how the Russian Orthodox leadership is making this a religious aspect. What words are he using?
The specific
what sins are being committed? Sins, right?
Yes.
What's he saying?
The specific words that were used were twofold. First of all, Russia is fighting a war of light against darkness, and it's a metaphysical war. And the principal reason for that war is the existence of gay parades. He dropped the word pride, but it's the gay pride parades that somehow are causing the Russian missiles to be flying all over Ukraine. Now, the fact of the matter is that generally speaking, Eastern Europeans are not keen on politicizing the whole business of gender. And in Ukraine itself, yes, it's a free country, and in that regard, certain expression of these things is allowed. But generally speaking, neither the Orthodox Church nor the population at large is particularly welcoming, shall we say, all the new developments having to do with the gender politics in the West. So he's actually, it's just complete nonsense. And it's nonsense for Western consumption, for the consumption, again, of people who would actually take this seriously. But I think Father Cyril would probably have far more profound things to say on the matter.
Yeah, I would say that for now, during the entire tenure as the Patriarch Kirill indeed addressed the Russian people and indoctrinated, I would say, the Russian people with this doctrine of the Russian world. He believed that it is an evangelical, an evangelizing, not evangelical in the kind of, in the sense of a denomination, but evangelizing instrument for the Russian people that emerged from the atheist kind of propaganda. And but lastly, I would say,
by the way, what do you mean by Russian world?
Yeah, the Russian world, I tried to explain in the beginning, it's just this mixture of different ideologems, elements of different ideologies, like the monarchical Tsarist ideology, then the Soviet Stalinist ideology, then the post-Soviet ideologies. It's really a kind of a mixture of different elements. I call it usually, I call it like civilizational nationalism. It's a sort of exceptionism when they say we, the Russians, we have a unique mission given to us by God to save this world from itself, and that's why we are eligible to use any means to fulfill this mission.
The main claim is that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine occupy, quote unquote, the same spiritual space. And then the subtext of this is that Belarus and Ukraine and its people do not exist as distinct nations, that somehow they're distinct as one part of the Russian nation. So, I mean, it is a chauvinistic proposition. And it is also very arbitrarily selective, because in the 19th century, there was this idea of Slavophile, that is to say, some kind of spiritual unification of all Slavs. Well, then notice, of course, it excludes completely the Slavs that happen to be, for example, Catholics, such as Poles, let's say, or Czechs, etc. So it's a very pick and choose type of position, and it serves only one purpose, and it's precisely the purpose that Father Cyril articulated. It's this reconstitution of the Russian Empire of the 19th century with the Soviet sort of spin or backing, or some kind of Soviet Union nostalgia. Because remember, Putin said, and Putin has repeatedly said, that he treats the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I think our listeners can all think of greater catastrophes in the 20th century than the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but that is Putin's vision. That is his fundamental, that's what's driving him.
Yeah. And I would add to that also that it's not just about, the Russian civilization. Actually, this vision behind the Russian world is really cosmic. And my argument is that the Putin's kind of worldview is to a great extent dualistic Manichaean. He sees the world in black and white, divided into essentially ontologically good pieces and essentially ontologically bad parts of the world. And for him, of course, Russia is the quintessentially goodness of this world, and the rest of the world, the West, particularly the United States, is the incarnation of the global evil. This is kind of a sort of a worldview that he has, and he shares this worldview, I think, with many figures in the church, I believe, including Patriarch Kirill to a great extent. And that is also the message. You asked about the message of Patriarch Kirill. It is a dualistic message. It's a message that exactly polarizes the world between us and them. And for him, us is the Russians, and them is the rest of the world, particularly the Americans.
Yeah, I think what Americans need to hear in this conversation, what you two just very well articulated, which is most Americans were raised to think of Russians as atheists, and now the story is God. We are part of this cosmic righteousness that we will save the world through the true Russian way of Christianity. And
Russian nukes.
Yeah.
Russian nukes. That is
Well,
another way to
of course. But I'm saying that Cyril would say this. Patriarch Cyril would probably say this. And if Americans could understand that, they would ironically find within their own history this idea of a righteous, exceptional nation that has been millenarily called to save the world. It went originally from Christianity to democracy, right? And so we have to see kind of a strange analogy where democracy has been leveled, risen to the level of a religion in America, and how the Russians are doing a counter move.
Randall, I believe from the perspective, at least of our tradition, Orthodox tradition, this is heresy. This heresy was condemned as Gnosticism as early as in the 3rd century. So, and it's a very old thing. And we face this kind of thinking for centuries, and still we cannot overcome it, and still we face it. That's why we want to, to deal with the Russian world as a sort of deviation of the Orthodox tradition, doctrine. It's not the genuine expression of Orthodoxy, as many people would probably believe. They would say, oh, those, crazy Orthodox, they just fight because they're Orthodox. No, the fight happens because this is the deviation from the Orthodoxy, from the tradition that we firmly hold.
Yes, I certainly couldn't agree more. It truly is a profound distortion of the faith, and I think we certainly are very concerned about the way in which Orthodoxy today is being used, or rather misused, by the Russian state, by the Russian government. Of course, there are other uses of Orthodoxy that are much more peaceful in terms of humanitarian aid and support that's being provided by major charities, such as, for example, International Orthodox Christian Charity, that was, of course, organized in the United States. And I think what violence has evoked in so many people, in hundreds of thousands and millions, is actually a desire to do something and to alleviate the suffering that's going on and the enormous humanitarian problem that's going on. So if we could talk a little bit about that, I would, I think that'd be helpful.
Let's go to that subject. We'll start with, remember, some of our audience doesn't know anything about Orthodoxy and might even consider it heresy. And so give us some help here. What are the theological foundations for peace building among people that deeply disagree about the ultimate truth? In other words, in a pluralistic world of atheists and Muslims and Taoists and various forms of Christian, what tools, what theological tools come out of Orthodoxy that says this is how we ought to behave in a world where there's such division over what is the ultimate good?
So I think first and foremost, this negotiation of pluralistic world is something that Orthodoxy is only just now entering in a kind of a mature fashion. The resources, of course, for dealing with this question are quite considerable, including specifically liturgical resources. So the daily cycle of Orthodox services mentions in prayer the word peace 15 times. That might indicate an anxiety precisely over the question of peace that the ancient Byzantine Empire had, because of course it was attacked on all sides, Arabs, Slavs, what have you. But I think the liturgical setting in which peace is the fundamental, shall we say, attitude that one has to have towards God, and peace ultimately is something that is God-given. I think that's actually a deep connection between, let's say, Orthodoxy and evangelicals. And I think an element that peace needs to be found within, that it cannot be simply found exclusively by policymaking, as important as policymaking is, I think is another element that would connect the Orthodox piety with evangelicals. In terms of peace bringing, I think, generally speaking, of course, Orthodoxy should not be endorsing a war of invasion. and yet that is precisely what the present war is, and certainly Russian Orthodoxy endorses it. And then most groups, 99% of all religious groups within Ukraine, of course, have spoken very, very strongly against the war. So there is a sense in which at least there is a kind of an outcry, really, to the world at large. And Cyril is participating in this, Cyril Hovorun is participating in that collective outcry in a very powerful manner. I think that's going on. So maybe, Cyril, you could probably add to.
Well, actually, no, I completely agree. Well, the thing is that indeed, even though we have a lot of resources in our patristical liturgical traditions in the past, and if you just, collect quotes from the fathers and mothers of the church on the piece, it will go volumes, really. The thing is how to apply this volume to our days, and that is kind of the challenge for this generation. I believe this is a major task for this generation of public theologians in the Orthodox Church, to do something that the Western theologians did after the World War II, because the World War II was not just the collapse of the ideologies of communism and Nazism. It was not just the collapse of Germany and and Italy, whatever the allies. It was also the collapse of a sort of theology that had developed in the 30s. That theology underpinned very much, fascism and Nazism, and then there was a huge work of deconstruction of this totalitarian theology that existed in the decades before that. It's something that we need to do. We haven't done this in the Orthodox tradition, and that's the kind of the most imminent task, I think, for us as the Orthodox theologians of the generation.
There will have to be a kind of a come to Jesus moment for the Russian Church and its leadership, because out of 40,000 minor clergy, 40,000, only 300 spoke publicly, only 300, that's what, 0.75 of 1%. And again, this is an important and laudable expression, of course, of anti-war spirit. But what I want to ask is, where are the rest? Where are the rest 99%? Some are silent, some are complacent, and some even actively endorse Patriarch Kirill's position on the matter. So I think, Paul, to answer your question directly, there's a fundamental failure as far as Russian Orthodoxy is concerned to articulate precisely a vision of peace, really Christ-given vision of peace. As far as other Orthodox heads of the churches are concerned, most of them have spoken quite strongly, of course, against the war and have issued very, very strong statements. Given our system and given the fact that we do not have any kind of central governance or a papal figure at the top, unfortunately, their voices are presently not being heard. That said, I think God certainly puts into the hearts of Orthodox, be it Romanians, be it Orthodox of all persuasions, essentially to work for peace and to alleviate suffering. So I would think that the kind of theology in action that we now have is a theology that basically tells everybody who is concerned about this horrendous war, when you wake up, do something about it. And if you can fight with peaceful means, what would those be? And I think, therefore, lots of us are doing humanitarian work, organizing various things. I am in charge of something called Rebuild Ukraine, and you can find us on the web. What we're providing at the moment, specifically as a kind of a peacekeeping operation as humanitarian aid, we're providing medical supplies and specifically tourniquets, and these are devices that are designed to stop blood. And we are also setting up a medical infrastructure that would allow people to order prescription drugs remotely, because in 2 weeks there will be more people dying out of the prescription drug shortage problem in Ukraine than there actually will be dying in battle or from shrapnel. So that's a key logistical element that I believe this particular organization will be set up to do. And thankfully, we're getting considerable interest and support from the United States, and not just from fellow Orthodox, from everybody, really from everybody, from the United States, to set this up in the quickest manner possible. Of course, we're acting in a very, very tight schedule, as you can imagine, because the war, unfortunately, doesn't wait. The war is just happening now, and the infrastructure of the cities is being destroyed now. And I think if you have, if the listeners, for example, have a charity that they trust, a charity that has already proven itself as doing the good work, if they could simply join in that charitable activity, I think this will do a lot of good for more than 3 million refugees that Poland and many other European countries are also trying to now accept. We've also set up a program in Lithuania for Ukrainian children to come and study at prep schools, and we will be setting up study abroad programs in the United States, including Ellen Academy in Bryan, Texas, that will be just one of our partners. So again, this is a way in which people of goodwill and also religiously affiliated institutions can really contribute to this process of peace building, returning to the notion of peace.
We'll be sure to let the listeners know again at the end of this, in a few more minutes, how they can participate there. Thank you, Paul. Cyril, I'm going to push in on one of the things you mentioned, and I'll go a little farther. I'm always intrigued about what's on the edge of theology. When you mentioned that all Eastern Orthodoxy is dealing with the problem of pluralism, can you, this is the way we often frame this. A proselytizing church is a church that believes in the essential truth that it has, and non-arrogantly, without arrogance, but with great sincerity, tries to convert others to that higher way.
Yeah.
In a pluralistic world where there are competitions between these different views of what is the highest way, what is the edgy, or what is the new view in Orthodoxy that is allowing the coexistence of both proselytizing and dialogue, if you will, between those groups?
Yeah, I think your question hits the kind of the core, if you want, of the situation, and indeed it has to do to a great extent with the perception of pluralism and the attitude to pluralism. The Russian society is certainly not pluralistic, and it's increasingly monolithic and chasing out pluralism, and that is the paradox, by the way. On the one hand, the Russian church and the Russian people in the Russian leadership, they kind of court the religious groups outside Russia, like the evangelicals in the United States, or the Catholics, for example, and try to develop some kind of relationships with them. At the same time, they persecute severely the same Protestant evangelical Christians or the Catholics in Russia. And that is unimaginable. Why? Well, they do it exactly because they believe in their complete monopoly on the Russian scene. And if you start, persecuting pluralism, you never end up somewhere. You never stop. And that's how, yes, they started persecuting, the witnesses of Jehovah, for example. They have criminalized the witnesses of Jehovah in Russia. Now they purge and close down like evangelical Baptist communities in Russia, or the Catholic communities. They stop Catholic charities in Russia, and now they don't stop there. They go as far as to accusing other Orthodox of not being Orthodox enough, like the Ecumenical Patriarchate or other churches. They now invaded Africa. They started a new kind of mission in Africa. It means that you cannot stop if you start, pursuing monopoly, if you start, persecuting pluralism. And I believe it's really, we need, as Orthodox, we really need to learn how to combine our belief that we hold truth. I do believe that my church holds truth. That is a part of being Orthodox. At the same time, I fully respect, the opinions of other Christian brothers and sisters. That's something we need to learn. And the reaction to pluralism explains also the Russian world, because the Russian world in addition of being ideology, whatever, excuse me for using this term, but it is also a fundamentalistic kind of doctrine. I know there are kind of different interpretations what is fundamentalism, but if we take the scholarly kind of classical academic definition of fundamentalism, it's a reaction essentially against the modernization and secularization and pluralization of the society. From this perspective, the Russian world is fundamentalistic because it doesn't tolerate pluralism, and it has to learn pluralism in order to become something different, something more peaceable.
I think, would you also agree that this tendency, for example, it exists in my religious tradition. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we are the only true church, you understand? And yet we've somehow been able to try, and we're working through this right now. We're working through this pluralism problem of being honestly believing, as I would guess, even a Greek Orthodox or whatever you're Orthodox, you really believe that's the superior way. And dealing with that honestly in the world is something that we're all grappling with, I think. I just want to say that I'm glad the leadership is aware of this tension, because it's fundamental. It actually is a psychological reality that affects politics. It affects a lot of other things. And we've found in our work, it's a contamination model, a public health model. It's as if the wrong view or the off view or the perverted view is contaminating the world. And how do you handle contamination, right? Well, how do you inoculate people? That's a more passive way. At certain times, you have to quarantine them, right? You set apart from them. And I see right now that the Russian Orthodox Church is saying, well, it's gotten so bad, we have to eliminate them.
Exactly.
Yeah, so, and there's this aspect that is deep. And I really
exactly. And I just want to throw a very short comment as well. Like, if you take the difference between the Russian situation and the Ukrainian situation, as it was said, Ukraine is a predominantly Orthodox country. The majority identify themselves as Orthodox and do practice Orthodox kind of Christianity. At the same time, it's intrinsically an intrinsically pluralistic society, very much, probably because it was always on the edge, between the worlds. And the very name Ukraine means the borderland. That is the translation of the name of the country. And we learned our ways of pluralism, toleration towards others. We still hold our truths, Catholics, Orthodox, or evangelicals in Ukraine, but we live in peace with one another. We lived in peace until the invasion happened. That's a sort of peace that is one of those things that differentiate the Ukrainian Orthodox, if you want, and the Russian Orthodox. It's not doctrine, it's not faith, it's the attitude to the other. That is the basic difference.
Thank you for that. We're almost out of your time, and you gentlemen have given us a great deal of it. John has a way of ending these conversations with a question that is very open-ended. What question should we have asked you? What question do you wish we had brought to the table? If each of you would speak to the unasked question that you'd like to speak to now, you have your final few minutes. Go for it. What would you like to tell people? What do you think people ought to know more about Orthodoxy or about the current situation? Just what's on your heart and mind right now that you'd like to say?
I think probably the most important element is that there are plenty of Protestant communities today in Ukraine that are acutely suffering. There are, for example, pastors who have not left their congregations, deliberately stayed. There have been a few programs that were actually made on this. And I think if the churches that our listeners are a part of have informal relationships with these churches in Ukraine, because Protestants are much stronger in Ukraine than in Russia. As Father Cyril mentioned, there has been, in fact, a repression of Protestant groups in Russia. I'm connected, for example, to a wonderful Methodist seminary in Moscow. They've certainly had a hard time for a long time. We don't even know whether they would be able to function in the future. But the present situation is such that there is a humanitarian catastrophe of untold proportions going on in Ukraine. And therefore, if your listeners could use their resources and their connections, and also their government connections to pressure our government to do more sanctions-wise and in terms of military aid. I think that would be very much appreciated. Again, I am a part of a nonprofit called Rebuild Ukraine, and you can find us online at rebuild-ua.org. You will see what we're doing, and I think I've described already that we are focusing primarily on medical supplies. We also actually do emergency evacuation. So people could certainly contact me in the particular cases where a family needs to be evacuated, either from a war zone or from an area that's simply unsafe. And we have safe houses in the western part of the country, and also we have the capacity to move people outside of the country if they so desire. So that's my message.
Thank you, Paul.
And I would
Cyril,
completely
you got the
endorse.
last
I would
word.
completely endorse Paul's appeal. It's time to show deeds, not words. It's time for action, and I believe this is also an ecumenical opportunity if we want. It's not just about discussing outdated theological ideas. It's about common action, and I believe that through the common action we could get closer to each other, much closer than through the theological conversations. So it's kairos for the action. Let us show action.
All right, that's you're quoting Saint James, who says, show me your works to prove your faith, right? And I might add with my favorite Orthodox voice, a Russian voice, Dostoevsky, in his great book, The Brothers Karamazov, said to had Father Zosima remind the lady who was talking about how she could love universally the world. He said, well, you can love the person down the street. Active love is the only love that counts. And so I think both of you are making an appeal for active love. John, you have the last word.
Well, thanks to everyone for being here. My hope is, and I'm sure you all share this, that we have a positive and speedy resolution to this unfortunate war, this invasion. And I also hope one of the things that I have experienced through this in self-criticism is a greater awareness of the failures of the church in the West to work with and act as if we are one body in Christ with the church in the East. And my hope is that there can be some positive outcomes in that. I want to thank Randy for leading as co-host. I did a lot of good listening here, and thank you, Randy. I also want to thank our guests, Paul and Cyril. Please look in the program notes for their biographies, for some links to where you can find their work. And especially we want to draw attention again to Rebuild Ukraine. There will be a link there. Please make a financial contribution to that and to other charities as they are seeking in this moment to help the people of Ukraine. Again, gentlemen, thank you for being a part of the podcast.
Take care.
God bless you both.